Thank you so much, Nawara team, and thank you everybody for being here in this space with us tonight. So in this talk, I will embody different modes of sharing knowledge and experiences. Some parts of it will be personal and others will be political because I don't believe in a separation between personal and political, as much as I don't believe in the separation between the mind and the body. So you can consider it a performance or a theater piece or however you like. And I look forward to your questions and your comments, objections, call outs at the end. I will be sharing some photos and maybe also memes throughout. So I will now share my screen with you. So this is, here we go. So I know we probably most of us are zoomed out, but so thank you for being here one more time. So trying to prepare something for about the topic of healing and recovery, I had to remember the point of my life where I started to work as a psychosocial counselor at a refugee organization in Cairo. I was encouraged to apply to the job by a friend of mine who's a psychologist and a feminist activist who led the team responsible for sexual and gender-based violence. And until that point, the team, the SGBV team or the sexual and gender-based violence team consisted of 3 women. And my friend explained to me that the team needs a male colleague because more men are coming forward to report sexual violence. And they aimed to have a standard where survivors of sexual violence could choose the gender of the counselor they work with according to what they feel comfortable with. So obviously, I was a bit hesitant to apply, and the task seemed huge. The topics were very heavy, and I wasn't actually trained as a social worker. I'm trained as a pharmacist. But even my choice to study pharmacy goes back to my interest in, as a child, in questions of healthcare and questions of well-being. So I didn't really end up practicing pharmacy very much, and I started my activism and my work in areas of gender and sexuality. So my friend insisted that I am a natural, and she told me if people come to me for counseling and for comfort, then I'm the right person for the job. So of course I didn't start working with clients until an extensive period of training. And after that, I was doing psychological counseling, trauma work, crisis intervention, and day in and day out, I would listen to stories of domestic violence, sexual violence, and I would accompany people to government offices, police stations, hospitals, clinics. But I really understood my work as to accompany people through trauma. So I think these 2 years have been some of the richest years of my life, so at the same time, some of the most difficult. And although I was initially hired to work with male clients, the percentage of women coming in to our team were much higher. So I was actually surprised how many women were ready to work with a male counselor. And one of the unforgettable people that I worked with was Zainab. That's, of course, not her real name. And she was a Sudanese refugee who was a mother of 5 children, and she also cared for her husband because he lived with a disability. And she survived rape in her home in 6 October at the hands of 3 Egyptian men. So Zainab insisted on reporting to the police. And when she went to the police station, of course, she was dismissed. So she became angry and she was eventually physically assaulted by the police. So she went on to report the police officers who assaulted her. And our team, our legal team, were supporting her with that in the organization. So she obviously never won one of any of these battles, but I know that it brought her a sense of dignity and pride. And that's an idea that keeps coming back to me as we remember the revolution. So this photo is from one demonstration from refugees in front of the UNHCR. And Zainab was actually, she was an activist, so she was very much involved in organizing against the structures that claim to support refugees. Um, so contrary to the common belief that mental health workers and social workers and therapists, um, we learn so much from our clients. And working with trauma can be dangerous. We are exposed to secondary trauma, but I think it also has some really fascinating aspects. Trauma confronts us with the worst and with the best. So we see the horrors that people inflict on each other. We see them at their worst, but we also see the power of care, the power of people's commitment to oneself, the power of people to rebuild themselves, and the power to be committed to something larger than individual survival. So I believe we cannot fully appreciate life's magic if we cannot examine the darker sides of life. So moving forward to 2014, I left Egypt and I became a refugee myself. This photo is one of my first photos I took in Germany. So even though exile is a violent experience, one of the powerful things about it is that we can examine ourselves, our culture, our history in new ways. And in many ways, my experience working in that refugee organization prepared me for my own exile experience and allow me to understand what exile is about. Anger, grief, paranoia, but also persistence, new beginnings, and hope. And I believe what I learned in Cairo were profound lessons about the power of empathy as a healing modality. But empathy alone is not enough. It has to have clear boundaries because empathy without boundaries is self-destruction. And I understand my work at that time as militancy. So working at an NGO in the Egypt context, as many of you know, means taking risk. And the organization was actually shut down by the government and part of the crackdown against NGOs in Egypt. So, and also being there with people was scary and messy. Sometimes the perpetrators would threaten us, a lot of different aspects. So by sharing this account about this organization and my work there, I don't want to idolize the helping professions or therapy, mental health workers. I have to say that my work here in Germany as a psychosocial worker has made me much more aware of the limitations of this kind of work, particularly when mental health workers don't understand their work as political. And in social work in particular, and other helping professions, this model of militancy stands in contrast with the model of motherhood, which underpins conventional mental health structures. So it might be useful to look at history, which is something that I love to do, to understand the limitations of these professions. A lot of these concepts of our work have originated in this part of the world. In Europe, in Germany has a strong history of leaders in social work, such as Alice Salomon, the one you can see now in the photo. And social work really grew out of the women movement, but the women movement were after the industrialization was more, there was a bourgeois women movement and the radical women movement. The radical women movement was more related in the worker and factory struggles, and the bourgeois women movement is the one where social work came from. And it is an extension of already existing state institutions of welfare, whose role was to determine who was worthy of support from the state and who was able to work and who wasn't. So both social work, psychiatry, and on those fields have actually the roots in hierarchies of power and social control of the other. And in this case, the poor, the sick, the mentally ill, or the neurodivergent. So I invoke this history to examine how they persist today. These observations are not just based on my experience as a mental health worker, but also my experience as a person trying to navigate and access mental health support in Germany as an asylum seeker, as a refugee, but also as a queer person. For example, in the asylum process, um, mental health support is not one of the things that are guaranteed. So in the time that people are most vulnerable, they cannot access mental health support. So I'm often faced with the fact that these systems are not made for us, or as Audre Lorde says, that we were never meant to survive. These experiences make me think of the necessity to decolonize mental health. And I would like to echo questions posed by Dr. Jennifer Molan, who is a Black therapist and one of the advocates for decolonizing mental health. She says, some of us have forgotten how much toxic masculinity and mediocre whiteness permeate the helping professions. Who gets to write the history books, the theories and frameworks? Whose ideas about the world get quoted, censored, studied, and valued? When we look at the legacy of so many fields, mental health specifically, we see long histories of white male theorists, violence against non-white male bodies, and the erasure of other kinds of wisdoms that might threaten the power of white men. Who gets to design the questions being asked? Who gets to interpret the data? Who gets books deals and tenure and their name repeated over and over again? All of this matters because it reveals who we do not listen to, who we do not trust or believe as well. So this need to decolonize mental health and the tension between the controlling subjects on one hand and alternative healing modalities on the other also has a long history. This photo is, of course, as obviously from witch hunts. So there are different theories that will explain witch hunts. And if we look at the crimes of the witches, there are basically three categories. One, the first category is sexual crimes, which means basically female sexuality. And the second crime or second category is organizing, so coming together is the crime that threatened the church and the state. And most importantly, is doing healing work. And it's not that in that context, healing was bad, but healing was okay at the level of male doctors who were working with the elite. But the women who were doing this work at the peasants, as a part of the peasant culture, that was not allowed and has to be destroyed. So this is why we need to think of community care and responsibility beyond helping professions. And here I refer to the concept of promiscuous care, which I resonate with. This is the topic in the one of the papers that I attached with the stock. And I personally love the word promiscuous because queer people are usually called promiscuous, and that's why I want to redefine its meaning. Um, so this care manifesto was published during the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and I will quote an excerpt. Promiscuous care means caring more and in ways that remain experimental and extensive by current standards. It means multiplying who we care for and how. Building on historical formations of alternative care-giving practices, we need to create the capacity for a more capacious notion of care. This is challenging because neoliberal capitalism underfunding and undermining of care have often led to paranoid and chauvinist caring imaginaries, looking after only our own. With adequate resources, time, and labor, people can feel secure enough to care for, about, and with strangers, as if they were kin. Promiscuous care recognizes that we all have the capacity to care, not just mothers, not just women, and that all our lives are improved when we care and are cared for and when we care together. So before I finish, I want to share a story with you to take a closer look at alternative healing modalities, which I mentioned before. As I said, my experience is that this system is not made for us, and especially that's coming from my experience as a queer person of color. So this naturally meant for me turning towards the self, and I explored a lot of self-therapy modalities, but also turning towards community. So this photo, I think it's only an inside joke. If you get it, you get it. If you don't, you don't. So recently, I have set up a small altar at my place in Berlin. I also have some candles, some plants, some stones, incense, but also I had also photos of people, loved ones who passed away. So it serves for me as a meditation corner or a grounding space. So when people come over to my place, sometimes they ask me, "أنت بتحضر عفاريت?" Or "Are you conducting a seance?" So it is. So it's partly يعني inspired for me on animistic and indigenous cultures. And animism, as you probably know, it's the perception that all things, animal, plants, rocks, weather systems, but even words are animated and alive. And partly it is inspired from the tradition of the Mexican Day of the Dead. A few years ago, I was invited by a friend of mine to attend the ritual. And we were celebrating that Day of the Dead, which usually honors and pay respect to the ancestors. But of course, we celebrated a queer version of the Day of the Dead because this ancestors is a very charged term. So for some of us don't even have the privilege of knowing their ancestors, or some people don't want to be associated with their ancestors. So we celebrated the queer version of chosen family. And what's really intriguing for me about the Mexican Day of the Dead is that how festive and celebratory and the joy that permeates the whole ritual. Cooking together, collecting flowers, decorating, baking, eating, drinking together. So it's a really celebratory form of grief work. So that was really intriguing for me. So this is one of the photos that I had at the altar at some point. And the person in the photo is a friend of mine who we lost at a very young age. This photo is from 2010, I think. And as you maybe see, it's in Tahrir Square. So I have avoided to talk about the revolution somehow, but this is also, I think I'm trying to embody the idea that the revolution is not a single time event. And even that space, Tahrir, has so many different alternative histories that a lot of people don't know about. So I'm thinking here about the whole queer narrative of the revolution that is not mainstream and probably still not told. Um, so yeah, so we lost Abdurrahman at a very young age to suicide, and that's why when I'm talking about grief work, um, it's not about only death and it's not about bereavement and losing people, but it's also grieving past self or a lost revolution, if you will, or friendships that ended, or love relationships that ended, but also places we left behind, or time served in prison, or time served in exile. So probably you do not know Abdurrahman, but you have heard of Sarah Higazi, I would believe. The activist who also died in exile last year in Canada. And I was actually haunted by the message that you can read now in the last message or the last words that Sarah said. To the world, you have been very cruel, but I forgive. And that's the second text that I attached to this talk, because I wrote this article trying to imagine why Sarah wrote these words. So I'm very well aware that forgiveness is can sounds like a naive notion or a religious notion, or that even perpetuates subservience and maintains the status quo. But I'm also thinking through with the words of Bill Hooks, who says forgiveness and compassion have always been interlinked. And how do we hold people accountable for wrongdoing and yet at the same time remain in touch with their humanity enough to believe in their capacity to be transformed? And this is, I think, what Sarah was trying to do, is to encourage us to be transformed. Forgiveness allows us to redefine ourselves in relation to how we see ourselves, but also in relation to other people. And it offers a space of agency and autonomy in a time where we increasingly understand ourselves as victims. So, this is an invitation to investigate our political emotions. We are often caught in a cycle of anger and indignation, especially in activism, social justice, um, being angry at the horrible things going on in the world. In the meantime, we bypass other feelings, namely guilt, grief, sadness, but also positive feelings like joy and love. So I think ولكنه يسامح is an invitation to forgive the other, but most importantly, to forgive ourselves. And on that note, I thank you so much for listening.